Оның ішінде мына аутизмі бар балаларға қалай қолдау көрсету, қалай оларды оқыту, әрине біздің мына педагогтардың арасында көп сұрақ туындап жатыр. Осыны бәрін жан-жақтан қарап зерделеу мына біздің саламызда енді дамып келе жатыр. Осы бүгін Назарбаев университеттің профессорлары сіздермен бөлісіп, өздерінің үлкен өткізген зерттеулерін сіздердің алдарыңызға салады. Бүгін бізде спикерлер Сулошни Пассер, инклюзиялық білім беру саласындағы PhD докторы, Назарбаев университеті жоғары білім беру мектебінің профессоры. Мишель Саммертон, инклюзиялық білім беру саласындағы PhD, Назарбаев университеті жоғары білім беру мектебінің ассистент профессоры. Және Станислав Ханин, Назарбаев университеті жоғары білім беру мектебінің білім беру бағдарламасының PhD студенті. Осы кісілер бүгін спикерлер, жаңағы сіздердің алдарыңызда осы кісілер тақырыптағы өздерінің баяндамаларын айтатын болады. Уважаемые коллеги, здравствуйте. Я рада приветствовать вас на секционном заседании, которое проводится Министерством образования и науки Республики Казахстан совместно с Высшей школой образования Назарбаев университета. В первую очередь я хотела бы выразить благодарность Назарбаев университету за тесное взаимодействие с Министерством образования, за то, что постоянно они делятся своими исследованиями, научными подходами. Сегодня тема нашего секционного заседания – это диагностика аутизма в казахстанском контексте, образовательные последствия. Очень важная тема. Мы с вами знаем, что в связи с развитием инклюзивного образования у нас дети с особыми образовательными потребностями сейчас учатся совместно с наших общеобразовательных школах. И сегодня дети с аутизмом – это особые дети, которые у нас выделились в отдельную группу, и мы сейчас должны с вами найти подходы, как работать с такими детьми. Потому что большие вопросы возникают у наших педагогов общеобразовательных школ. И сегодня у нас своими исследованиями, своими темами поделятся профессора Назарбаев университета. Это в первую очередь Сулошни Пассер, доктор PhD, профессор Высшей школы образования Назарбаев университета, Мишель Саммертон, также это доктор PhD в области инклюзивного образования, ассистент профессора Назарбаев университета Высшей школы образования, и Станислав Ханин, это студент PhD по программе Назарбаев университета. Вот эти спикеры сегодня вам представят свои доклады, поделятся своими идеями. И если у вас будут возникать вопросы, вы, пожалуйста, в чат пишите. На все вопросы будут даны ответы. Сегодня я хочу сказать, что первый день нашего заседания. Завтра, 18 августа, также состоится продолжение этой темы. Поэтому мы будем ждать и ваше присутствие на завтра. А сейчас я хотела бы предоставить слово Сулошни Пассер. Пожалуйста.
Thank you for that very warm welcome, Aigerim. It's lovely to see you again. And good afternoon, colleagues and friends, and other members of the Ministry of Education. We would like to present to you some of our data and findings from a recent project we conducted.
Плохо слышно, плохо слышно.
We would like to present some of the findings from a much larger project looking at the diagnosis of autism and learning difficulties and intellectual impairment in the Kazakhstani context. Today, I'm accompanied by two of my colleagues on the project, Dr. Michal Somerton, who's a co-PI on the project, and Stanislav Kanin, who's the research assistant. The other members of the team are Dr. Valentina Stolyarova, who's also a co-PI, and Professor Altenshas Jaksibayeva from Astana Medical University. So as you can see, we have a very strong team of members who are not just in education, but also from the medical profession. This project has been funded by Nazarbayev University Faculty Grant Scheme, and it started in March 2019 and will be concluded in February 2021. Now, why did we decide on this particular project? There are three main concerns internationally relating to the diagnosis of special educational needs. The first concern is the different assumptions and theories about individual difference and disability which underpin measurement. These assumptions are based on three different models of understanding disability: the medical, social, and interactional ecological model. The second concern is the variety of divergent approaches based on the different assumptions. ICD-10 is an internationally accepted classification of disability from the World Health Organization. However, a review by the National Council of Special Education in Ireland in 2010 established that current practice across a number of countries indicate a variance in approaches and understanding. So there is no consistent approach or understanding of autism in relation to diagnosis, particularly for non-normative categories of disability. That is, those categories for which relatively objective assessment measures are not available. Normative categories would be those physical and sensory categories of disability which have objective measures. So as a result, difficulties with valid, accurate diagnosis of a condition, including autism, remains a practical concern. The third concern is the lack of valid instruments used to screen, assess, and diagnose specific categories of special educational needs. Concerns around the validity of screening instruments for the screening, assessment, and diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder are universal. A recent critical review of screening and diagnostic instruments for ASD in people with sensory impairment, in addition to intellectual disabilities, revealed that most instruments did not have the norms for the target population, and that all instruments of a quarter or more of invalid items. The instruments for screening and diagnosis of autism, which reviewed, were ABC, ADIR, ADOS, ASAS, ASQ, AUTI, DISCO,
Уважаемые участники, прошу отключить все микрофоны, чтобы переводчик слышала профессора и могла переводить. Кому не слышно, надо будет подключить наушники, тогда будет лучше слышно. Спасибо.
Janar, is it okay now? Okay, so we were talking about the third concern, which is around the lack of valid instruments used to diagnose autism. One of the key recommendations from the European Commission is the need to develop screening mechanisms that reflect the cultural variations and diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds of families. If we turn to the Kazakhstani context, as you know, one of the 100 steps outlined by the first president of Kazakhstan in his vision is to become one of the top developed nations in the world by 2025. Included in these 100 steps is the provision of equitable, accessible, and quality education for all citizens of Kazakhstan. Efforts are also underway to achieve 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2050, which includes goal number 4, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting learning opportunities for all. The focus includes children with disabilities, including autism. Education for all children is a constitutional right and ensures access for children with disabilities to the Okay, I don't know how this is happening with all the lines going through the text. Yeah. Okay, Janar, are we okay now? Okay. A law in...
Уважаемые коллеги, выключите микрофоны все, кроме переводчика и спикера. Мы же просим вас. Ну я же не могу всех отключить, тогда не будет слышно вам переводчика и спикера. Участников же много, около 250 уже. Без конца заходят. Давайте. Спасибо.
Okay. So the...
Микрофоны выключите, уважаемые коллеги. Сложно переводить, одновременно слушать спикера. Сразу вот тут внизу значок, кто только зашел, посмотрите. Сразу выключите микрофон.
Okay, can we continue, Jana? Okay, so the law in 2002 on social, medical, pedagogical, correctional support for disabled children this and spells out provisions for disabled children. Okay, plans to establish 30.
Кто заходит, сразу выключайте микрофон. Коллеги, у нас много заходит, сразу 10-15 человек, поэтому у нас, если вы записали, да, уже 12 минут, как мы начали.
Коллеги, микрофоны у Солошни не включен. Солошни, your microphone is not turned on.
Okay, Jana, is it okay?
Now it's on.
Okay, can I continue?
Please.
Okay, so plans to establish 30/30 inclusive schools, which will include special education teachers, psychology and pedagogical support, and special individual technical and compensatory needs is underway. However, there are issues in Kazakhstan. While the legal framework supports provision for children with disability, there is a lack of formal guidelines or policy on a coordinated approach to assessing special educational needs. Hence the need for this study to understand processes currently in practice. An initial review through informal discussions with the Ministry of Education and partners from NUSOM and from AMU revealed that pedagogical, medical, psychological consultants will sit on commissions, carry out assessment and diagnosis of SEN. Following diagnosis, a whole range of rehabilitation services is provided, and based on the diagnosis, decisions are made on whether the child is included in specialized or non-specialized settings. However, as you are well aware, many still remain at home with families and may receive no education at all. Okay. So the aim of the study is to explore understandings and conceptualizations of disability, particularly autism, which underpin diagnostic tools and processes. The second aim is to provide a review of the national diagnostic procedures, the tools and standards that are being used to diagnose special educational needs, specifically autism, and to identify the professional backgrounds, qualifications, and experience of those undertaking the diagnosis as a way of understanding the background and how these professionals understand autism. Fourthly, to explore the extent to which these understandings and processes differ across regions, to determine the extent to which education and health services are coordinated during such services, and finally, to provide recommendations to the Ministry of Education as well as the Ministry of Health to strengthen and improve diagnostic systems and processes that are in place. The focus of our study was therefore to look at firstly the knowledge and understanding. How do professionals understand autism? How have they gained this understanding, and what qualifications do they possess which qualifies them to carry out the diagnosis? Secondly, the process of diagnosis. How is diagnosis of autism currently taking place? What are the procedures and how long does it take? Then what tools and instruments are being used to diagnose autism? Where do they originate from, and how have they been adapted to the local context? And finally, are there any regional variations? Is there any consistency in the processes and the uses of the tools that are employed? And are there any challenges? Stas?
Здравствуйте, коллеги. Солошник, большое спасибо за вашу часть. Коллеги, меня зовут Ханин Стас, я докторант Высшей школы образования. Я расскажу вам больше о методологии нашего исследования, как мы собирали данные, как мы их обрабатывали, и потом передам слово своей другой коллеге. Меня хорошо слышно?
Да, хорошо слышно.
Да,
Отлично.
слышно.
Тогда я начну. Значит, методология нашего исследования – это стратегия смешивания методов. Что это значит? Это значит, что были использованы и качественные методы исследования, которые позволяют получить глубокую картину происходящего. То есть мы проводили интервью, во время которых можно задать дополнительные вопросы или уточнить заинтересовавший нас ответ. Также были использованы и количественные методы исследования, то бишь опросник. Опросники позволяют определить закономерности, обобщать результаты на популяцию. Совместив два этих сильных метода, мы смогли получить глубокие и насыщенные данные, на основе которых можно делать более продуманные выводы, можно делать более продуманные рекомендации. На слайде вы видите последовательность наших действий, как мы проводили исследование. Обратите внимание на первый оранжевый кружок. Это часть исследования опросник с марта по сентябрь 2019 года. Кто были участниками нашего опросника? Это специалисты, которые участвовали в диагностике аутизма. Это были неврологи, психиатры, педиатры, генетики и другие специалисты. Вы видите их на слайде. Мы хотели установить региональные закономерности, понять, как профиль какого-то участника влияет на то, как он понимает, что такое аутизм. Во время опросника, конечно, мы собирали персональную информацию, какой у них опыт обучения у наших специалистов, где они работают, являются ли они членами психолого-медико-педагогической комиссии. Мы также хотели узнать, как они понимают аутизм, и узнать больше о том, какого диагностического процесса они придерживаются и какие инструменты они используют. После этого, обратите внимание на синий кружок, это январь-февраль 2020 года, мы провели серию интервью. Всего мы провели 27 интервью в 4 разных регионах Казахстана. Нас также интересовало, как специалисты понимают аутизм, какой диагностический процесс, какого процесса они придерживаются, какие инструменты они используют. И очень важно, мы спрашивали каждого из участников рассказать нам о каком-нибудь реальном примере диагностирования кого-нибудь с аутизмом. То есть они нам должны были дать реальный кейс того, как они работали, каких процедур придерживались и что они делали. Обратите внимание на следующий кружок. Нет, мы еще на прошлом слайде. Вот это был январь-февраль 2020 года. При создании исследования планировалась и стадия наблюдения за сотрудниками психолого-медико-педагогической комиссии. В конечном итоге осуществить эту часть исследования не было возможным, и поэтому мы смотрим на следующую стадию нашего исследования – это распространение. Мы с коллегами пишем статьи. Эти статьи сейчас находятся в редакциях, на рассмотрении редакции журналов. И, конечно же, мы очень рады возможности тому, что мы можем рассказать о нашем исследовании на этой конференции, и не только на этой, международных тоже. К февралю 2021 года мы планируем представить вам заключительный отчет нашего исследования. Итак, следующий слайд.
Микрофон.
Слайд. Коллеги, следующий слайд. Спасибо. Я хочу рассказать вам больше об опроснике, который мы создали. Опросник был размещен на платформе Qualtrics. Опросник был полностью онлайн, но была и бумажная версия, то есть участники, которые не могли участвовать онлайн, могли заполнить опросник на бумаге. Участвовать в опроснике можно было по анонимной ссылке. Так, микрофон кто-то включил. И опросник был доступен на казахском и русском языках. Привлекали мы специалистов по почте, WhatsApp, группах, и наши коллеги из медицинского университета Астана и из школы медицины Назарбаев университета, они имели выход на специалистов, которые были приглашены участвовать в исследовании. В конце опросника каждому из участников было предложено участвовать в интервью, и они могли оставить свои данные, и позже мы бы связались с ними, и они участвовали в интервью. 27 человек, как вы уже видели, участвовали в интервью. Процент ответивших на опросник был невелик. Это было всего лишь 17%. И, к сожалению, это помешало нам устанавливать закономерности на основе данных, количественных, которые мы собрали в опроснике. Но, тем не менее, данные были все равно богаты, и мы узнали многое, и это подготовило нас, конечно, к проведению интервью. Давайте посмотрим на следующий слайд. Отлично. Вы видите 4 секции. По каждой из этих секций я и мои коллеги расскажут вам больше. Я сейчас хочу вам рассказать о первой секции. Данные опросника, которые мы собрали, они были обработаны в программе SPSS. То есть мы могли посчитать, сколько участников сказали то-то, сколько участников сказали то-то, сравнить эти данные и понять больше. Значит, что мы видим? Что самый частый источник повышения квалификации на тему аутизма для наших специалистов – это конференция, 41%. В большинстве специалисты неврологи. В большинстве они не члены психолого-медико-педагогической комиссии. В основном они из Алматы и из Астаны. Данные, которые мы собрали в ходе интервью, были анализированы другим способом. Мы присваивали им коды, мы выделяли темы. И после этого мы тоже могли видеть общую картину, мы могли сравнивать и сопоставлять эти данные с теми, которые мы собрали в ходе опросника. По пунктам 2, 3 и 4, которые вы видите сейчас на слайде, больше расскажет моя коллега Мишель. Мишель, вам слово. Мишель, now it's your turn.
Jana, can we just
Thank
take
you.
Michelle, if you can just hold on for a minute, I'll stop sharing and then reshare it. Thanks, Michelle. If you can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And can we just have them in English, please?
The English version.
Yes, please.
Okay, but the participants won't understand that, Michelle.
Is Jana translating?
She is translating, yeah.
Right, okay. I will just need to follow. I have my notes, but I will just need to follow because there's some of the quotes I will need to actually read out.
Okay, I'll have to pull up the English one. Okay, go ahead. Let me just pull up the English one. Yeah. Oops.
I tried to get them side by side, but when the share screen comes up, it doesn't allow me to be able to simultaneously go through mine.
Okay, can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, well, let me get down to your slide.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Jana, can you hear me?
Is that okay?
Jana? Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. Jana, can you hear me? I can't actually hear Jana.
You need to go to the bottom and just click on the globe, Michelle, and select English.
English, okay. Right. Yes, I can hear you now. That's wonderful. Thank you, Jana. And thank you also to my colleagues, Saloshni and also Stas, for their introductions so far. I think they've done a great job of outlining what the project is all about. So I want to say thank you to Aigerim and also Jana for their assistance and the invitation today to speak about the findings of our study. So I want to start just by explaining and giving an overview of the diagnosis of autism. So autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum. So it actually is not just a one category disorder. It refers to a broad range of conditions. Those deficits or challenges are mostly associated with social skills and repetitive behaviours. So according to the Centers for Disease Control, that's in the United States, autism affects an estimated of 1 in 54 children in the United States today. So as far as current research knows in relation to the etiology of autism, it is a combination of genetic and environmental factors. So because it's a spectrum, each person, each individual with autism will have a range of different strengths and challenges. Therefore, the ways in which people with autism learn and think can range from very highly skilled to severely challenged. So this will mean, particularly in relation to children, that some children will need a high level of support in their daily lives and in their learning, while others may need less support and can live entirely independently. Next slide, please. So what I touched upon in the previous slide was the rate of diagnosis in the United States. And what we know in other parts of the world, the rates of diagnosis in many countries are very similar. So in the context of Kazakhstan, the rates of diagnosis can only really be estimated. So with a population of approximately 18 million people, recent information from the Ministry of Health in 2018 estimate the prevalence of autism to be 2.6 per 100,000 individuals. And that rate of diagnosis is well below current global estimates. So this is one of the reasons that really underpinned wanting to investigate and wanting to research this topic in the Central Asian context, because nobody has actually really gone into this in depth before in this context. So we know that the rates of diagnosis are very low in comparison to other countries around the world. So we wanted to know why that might be. And so understanding and interviewing and surveying specialists that are involved in the diagnosis of children with autism can give us some idea of what's happening in this context. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over now some of the findings. Now, these are not every single finding. I'm just going to touch on some of the main findings that were quite interesting about this study in the Central Asian context. So on the survey, we asked specialists what was their understanding of autism. And we can see here when we did a frequency count of responses in the survey that the majority of specialists saw autism as a communicative and a social disorder, primarily. And we look at the other end of the scale, and we can see only a few considered it to be of genetic origins. So many of the responses, when we coded, the responses on the survey, fell into these 7 main categories: communication, social, behavior, cognition. We had in there as well mental disorder, brain disorder, psychological, and schizophrenia. Now we've separated those two because there's a difference between what we think about cognition and how we think about what is a psychological or a mental disorder. So those two were separated out. Next slide, please. Okay, so overall, every profession, whether they were pediatric neurologists or psychiatrists or defectologists or psychologists, mentioned an impairment in the category of communication. But what was interesting, most, or the majority, mentioned a delay in speech. So I'll give an example of some of the responses. Here, this was from the interviews. It is a complex systematic disorder that covers almost all spheres of the child. Cognitive and communication impairment with specific language impairment. These are all the Kanner symptoms. Now, Kanner was one of the first psychiatrists who basically coined the term autism, which is now known as autism spectrum disorder. So back then it was a specific category of diagnosis. The diagnosis today is a spectrum, which means there's a whole range of different kinds of challenges that we can see, but they mostly still fall into the same categories of communication and social understandings and repetitive and restrictive behaviors. Other understandings: a psychiatric disorder, a disturbance of interaction and behavior and emotion. Interestingly, some other responses: intellectual impairment and a memory impairment and a speech delay and psychomotor delay and stereotypic movement, and may have aggressive behavior. Now, what we do know as far as a diagnosis is concerned, not every child with a diagnosis of autism will have an intellectual impairment. And of course, some of the difficulties and challenges that children face with a diagnosis is that with a language impairment, it is very difficult to measure intelligence because the way we communicate our understanding is through language. So without the kinds of instruments that measure non-verbal intelligence, it's very difficult to tell if a child actually has an intellectual impairment.
Next slide, Michelle. We can't hear you, Michelle. Your sound is off.
Oh, sorry, I've been muted. Just the next slide, please, Salashni. So one of the other interesting dimensions that came from the interviews that we held was the aspect of empathy. Quotations from specialists such as, a child living in their own world, no emotions, cannot feel happiness, doesn't react to their name, child has poor emotions, such as when he sees his mother, he does not really react. Another quotation, no empathy, the child cannot understand the feelings of others. Now, one of the things we know from recent research is that children with autism do actually feel empathy. It's the way that they communicate, or they respond to certain situations are not necessarily as what we would expect from typical developing children. So there's been, sort of interviews with individuals with autism where they say they have an overwhelming flooding of different kinds of emotion, which make it very difficult to actually respond in a way that shows social and emotional understanding. So I've actually written here, this is a fraught area of research where flawed terminology, measurement and theory have all contributed to the mischaracterization of autistic people as lacking empathy to a severely negative effect. Next slide, please. So again, I will go back to where I mentioned about autism being a spectrum. Here we have some responses that really, again, be referring back to Canis syndrome. And this is one of the diagnoses under the ICD-10. And Kazakhstan currently uses the ICD-10, and that has a number of specific categories. So when a specialist is doing a diagnosis, they are trying to fit the child into a specific category. So they're trying to either Canis syndrome, atypical autism, Asperger's syndrome, and they're looking at the features or what the child is demonstrating in order to make a diagnosis. Now, with the introduction of the DSM-5 in 2013, the DSM-5 did away with all those different categories. And that was due to the reason that autism presents so differently in different individuals, that in many cases, it's very difficult to try and put a child into a specific category. So one of the quotations here, autism is also about Canis syndrome. I have never diagnosed a child with Asperger's, but many children with Asperger's may have a colossal memory or math skills. And that was from a clinical psychologist. And again, from a psychiatrist, autism is a disintegrative disorder of mental processes, which doesn't always have a total decline as in mental retardation. There are many forms. So there was the acknowledgement in some specialists that there was a separation between children with an intellectual impairment and autism and children without an intellectual impairment and autism. And one of the things that will be happening in 2022 is that Kazakhstan will adopt the ICD-11, which is the new version. Now, that ICD-11 is from the World Health Organization, as was the ICD-10. Now, with the ICD-11, there will be a separation between the diagnosis of autism without intellectual impairment and autism with intellectual impairment. At the moment, children are just diagnosed with autism, whether it be Canis or atypical autism. And that means in many cases, it's very difficult to measure their IQ, their level of intelligence. And as we know, there are many children, even non-verbal with autism, that can have average to high intelligence. So autism as a diagnosis by itself doesn't mean an intellectual impairment. And the final quotation I want to just mention here is from a pediatric neurologist. Intellectual impairment and memory impairment and speech delay and psychomotor delay and stereotypic movement and may have aggressive behavior. So this was the range of different responses we had from different specialists involved in the process of diagnosis. So again, very difficult, cannot answer in one word. Autism is equivalent to schizophrenia in children. And the second quote, there is no full picture of autism, but there are autistic disturbances which match with others such as schizophrenia. As a specialist, I believe it is better for children to have a diagnosis of intellectual impairment than autism. Now we know that current research tells us as far back as 1998, 1999, that schizophrenia and autism are two distinct disorders. They have a similarity in that they overlap in the social and emotional domain. However, schizophrenia is very rare in young children, and I mean very, very rare, and it only can generally presents itself in early adolescence. One of the marked features of schizophrenia.
Your sound is off, Michelle.
Again, I've just been muted, sorry. Someone keeps muting me. So one of the marked features of schizophrenia is hallucinations and delusional thoughts. That is not the case with autism. Typically, individuals with autism operate on a very concrete and in a very literal manner. So they have difficulties with these inferences and understanding. If you try and tell a joke, they don't necessarily understand the joke because their cognitive profile is very literal, very concrete. So this is where there's the separation between schizophrenia and autism. Even so, these were some of the responses coming through in the interviews. So next slide, please. So moving on to another section of the survey, we wanted to understand what specialists' beliefs were about autism. So what do they believe about autism? So we provided a list of 16 statements just about children with autism and just autism in general. And these statements were taken from another research study done in 1987. And it was used to assess the attitudes and the beliefs of healthcare professionals in the United States. And in that previous study, it compared those attitudes and beliefs with those of experts in the research field. And so the 16 statements that we put into the survey consisted of some common beliefs or misconceptions concerning autism. Respondents could acknowledge whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement on a Likert scale from strongly agree, not sure, disagree, or strongly disagree. And there were approximately 45 participants that filled in these statements of beliefs and attitudes. And the reason that we wanted to capture those is that a specialist's attitudes and beliefs will influence the approach or the approaches that they take to the diagnostic process. And that can be very difficult, particularly when the diagnostic process is mostly subjective. When the diagnostic process is objective or using instruments that have been validated, then it is far less prone to subjective ideas or subjective knowledge And so therefore that has, when it's subjective, has a problem to influence the diagnosis process. Thanks. Next slide, please. So when we looked at this data about beliefs from specialists, what was most notable among many of the responses was the number of specialists who were unsure of certain statements. And I'll give you an example of some of those statements here. For example, with the proper treatment, most children with autism will outgrow autism. There were 13 participants that agreed with this statement, and they consisted of neurologists, psychiatrists, and a psychologist. And there were another 20 that were unsure. So taken together, this was approximately 75% of the responses. Now, it is well accepted internationally that autism is a lifelong disorder and is not something that can currently be cured. Next slide, please. Another statement. Children with autism usually grow up to be schizophrenic adults. The results indicated that 7 of respondents agreed with this statement and another 12 were unsure. So these numbers indicate that only just over half of the number of participants, around 57%, disagreed with this statement. Now, as I mentioned before in my previous slides, the association between autism and schizophrenia was a consistent theory going back to the American Psychiatric Association in 1952 and 1968. So we know in the last 20 years, this has been proven as incorrect. So there has been research that has actually indicated that the percentage of individuals with autism and schizophrenia is no higher than typical individuals. So the chance of having autism and schizophrenia is no different than being a typical individual and having schizophrenia. And I've put down at the bottom of the page, there's some references about that. So another statement, it is difficult to distinguish between autism and childhood schizophrenia. Now, this statement really highlights some of the difficulties that specialists are having in discriminating between a diagnosis of autism and childhood schizophrenia. So 10 neurologists, 3 psychiatrists, and 1 psychologist agreed with that. And that's not a negative thing in any way. For without the kinds of tools, objective measurements, it is very difficult to discriminate. If you are just making a diagnosis by just assessing the child subjectively, observing the child subjectively. So the interview data also supported this finding. So this was from the survey again, and at the same time, it highlights the social stigma of autism associated with what is seen in the Kazakhstani context as a psychiatric or mental disorder. So I mentioned that stigma before. That's fine, next slide, please. So the next statement, there is a social stigma associated with children with autism, e.g. children with autism bring shame to a family. Around 1/3 of respondents agreed that there is a social stigma attached to the diagnosis. And if I go back to what I mentioned before in the interviews, there were actually several psychiatrists that explained to the research team that they felt it was better for a child to have a diagnosis of intellectual impairment or a developmental delay rather than autism because of this stigma. And this may be in part, one of the reasons that the rates of diagnosis in Kazakhstan are so low in relation to the overall population. And of course, this has implications for the education context, because if children are being diagnosed with an intellectual impairment or a developmental delay, when they have a diagnosis of autism without intellectual delay or an intellectual impairment, then they're often missing out on the required support or access or opportunities to education. Next slide, please. Another statement, and this again relates to this dimension of stigma. So this statement, autism in children is attributed to immoral parental behavior. Now, this statement is associated with findings from a colleague of mine, Professor Sophia Ahn, who interviewed parents of children with autism in the Kazakhstani context. And in many cases, the stigma attached or associated with having a child with a disability is not just something that is unique to Kazakhstan or Central Asia. There are many parts of the world where a stigma is attached to a disability. Now, in many cases, these views originally attributed to the aberrant or just unusual behavior of mothers. And this idea also was associated with theories about autism that came or were very prominent in the 1950s, when there were researchers who believed that it was because of the parenting behaviors of mothers, that these mothers of children with autism were cold or detached. Okay, sure. Okay, thank you. So going back, so in the 1950s, there was a common theory concerning autism that related to parenting, and that it was cold mothers who were not warm and loving, that basically contributed to the child having a diagnosis of autism. And even this assumption appeared in the early research of Kanner in the 1940s. However, at the same time, Kanner did acknowledge that there was a potential biological or inborn cause for the disorder. Next slide, please. So again, this statement, this finding, correlates with another survey statement, which said autism in children is mostly attributed to neglect in early childhood. And we had 6 pediatric neurologists either strongly agreed or agreed with the statement, and another 6 were unsure. And one of the stories I was told when I was actually interviewing some of the participants, and this is one example, was a specialist who told me about a boy who had a diagnosis of autism. And while she's telling me about when she first met the child and the parents, that they were very wealthy, that the father was in the oil business, that the child, that the mother was traveling and also very busy working when the child was very young, and the child was placed with a nanny, and the child didn't really have much time with the mother. So underpinning these kinds of beliefs and ideas is still that pervasive idea that somehow the cause of autism is from an external factor, that's something that maybe the parents might be doing or might not be doing. Next slide, please. And again, this was with the final statement in this autism survey. Autism is preventable. 68% of participants either agreed with the statement or were unsure. Therefore, 4 neurologists, 4 psychiatrists, and 1 psychologist agreed. So that's 9 participants agreed with that statement. 12 neurologists, 7 psychiatrists, and 1 psychologist were unsure. So we know that autism, as we know it today, is not preventable because we don't necessarily know 100% what actually causes it. So as there is thought to be a genetic and environmental basis for the disorder, there are no known preventative measures. Therefore, autism is currently not preventable. And the final slide on the beliefs that I will talk about today is, it is important, the statement, it is important that children with autism receive special education services at school. And we can see overwhelmingly that most, or the majority of specialists agreed, either strongly agreed or agreed with that statement. There were only a small percentage, 5% were unsure, and 2% disagreed with that statement. Next slide, please. So then we move on to the findings that relate to what are the sources that contribute to specialists' knowledge. So when we did the analysis on the survey data, we saw that the most frequent source of information that was cited by participants was the literature. And then that followed by when working. To a lesser degree, other sources, other specialists said based on symptoms, during observation and examination of a child. That indicates a heavy reliance on experience based in practice. So we saw the 2 main sources of information that contribute to specialist knowledge coming from either what they are reading or based on what they were doing in practice. Next slide, please. Again, in the interviews, when we asked participants the sources that contributed to the specialist knowledge, their own knowledge, they indicated that it was part of their training at university and practical experience. However, when we go deeper into that training at university, one psychiatrist said, practical experience, no one was teaching. Most specialists mentioned reading books for accessing information and also said that they had received no specific training. For example, a pediatric neurologist said during practical assessments, but no specific training. And a psychiatrist, major source, practical experience, reading as well. And another psychiatrist, I understand this during basic medical training and specialization in psychiatry when learning about schizophrenia. So again, even in the university training, there is still this association that persists between the link between autism and schizophrenia. Next slide, please. This table shows a very good example of the sources of information that specialists use to make a diagnosis. And what we can see here is most of the information comes from discussion with the family. So when a child comes in for a diagnosis, it's heavily, the diagnosis is heavily weighted towards what the information from the family give. And that's very important. And that's a very, very positive a very positive dimension to actually see with a diagnostic process, because parents know their children better than anybody. It's mentioned in here cognitive and developmental assessments. But again, when we delved into that aspect of cognitive and developmental assessments, these cognitive and developmental assessments were mostly made subjectively. So the specialist would have a book and point to an animal like a cow and say, can you tell me what sound the cow makes? Or point to a bird and say, can you tell me what sound a bird makes? Now, if you have a child that has difficulties in social and emotional communication, then the child might not respond as what a typical child would. So therefore, that assessment ends up being a developmental delay or intellectual impairment, because the child is not responding to that test in the way that the same aged peer may respond. So again, then we have doctor's reports and clinical tests. And these reports and clinical tests are mostly to rule out other biological disorders that might explain why the child is behaving the way he is. Again, interview with the child, psychologist report. So there's a lot of information drawn from other specialists, which is very good. However, those reports may often be conflicting. Next slide, please. And here we have a list of some of the tools that specialists said they use to diagnose autism. Now, the ICD-10 is a classification. It's not actually a diagnostic tool. The ICD-10 provides the categories of CANAS, atypical autism, or Asperger's, in which a specialist will make a determination of where that child will fit. Actual tools for diagnosis would be the ABC Autism Behavior Checklist, the MCHAT, which is a screening tool, the ADOS, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. And these were all tools that my colleague, Professor Pather, mentioned earlier in this presentation. We have here DSM-5 and DSM-4. Again, like the ICD-10, these are not diagnostic tools. These are classifications. Next slide, please. And some of the challenges that specialists mentioned when they were using these tools. The main challenge that came out was the lack of time at an appointment. So most specialists indicated they would only mainly have about 2 appointments. The rest of the time, the child might be in a day clinic where the child would be observed by the psychiatrist, observed by the logopedist, observed by the defectologist. So they will be watching how the child interacts with other children, watching how the child plays, the kinds of toys that they play with. Another challenge was poor mastery of any diagnostic tools. And down here on the table, we can see that in many cases, in also very few cases, the tools or specialists had access to the tools that were adapted to the Russian language. And that's even more problematic in some instances when it comes to the Kazakh language. Again, there were few tools that were adapted to the Russian cultural concepts. And the same again to the Kazakh language and cultural concepts. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to, there's some of the major findings. I think the main findings that I thought were very interesting to come out of this study. And so they're very interesting areas that we could explore and gave us an idea on what is, perhaps why we have such low rates of diagnosis in Kazakhstan, and understanding some of the challenges that our specialists here are facing when it comes with making a diagnosis and an accurate diagnosis. Now, I have to say that the diagnostic process in many parts of the world is very challenging. It's, you know, having training for defectologists, having training for psychiatrists is a very important part of that. So it's not just something that is unique to the Kazakhstani context or the Central Asian context. This is a challenge for specialists all over the world. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to present some of these findings from our research. And I would now like to turn over to my colleague, Professor Pather, who will give a summary of the findings.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle, for that very thorough and in-depth insight into the data that has been collected and analyzed. That was very interesting, I'm sure, and there'll be lots of questions that people have on that. So, but before we do that, I'd like to just share a summary of the actual, the data. I can't seem to, yeah. Okay, can you see this? Okay. Michelle,
Yes,
is that
yes.
clear? Janar?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay.
Volosny, sorry.
Okay. Well, the
but
first conclusion, the summary of the data was that the range of understandings of autism, and there's no mention of a spectrum. There appears to be a general understanding of variations between children with autism from psychiatric psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, but each child has to be placed into a clear category, which is consistent with the ICD-9 and the ICD-10 criteria. However, an understanding of the variations is evident in the explanations from the educational psychologists and psychologists. And at no time when we look at the data has any participant or made
Выключите, пожалуйста, микрофон. Включенный микрофон тех, кто только заходит. Вот снова. Даже говорите.
Yeah, so at no time, as I said, did a participant mention or make references to an autistic spectrum, the mention of a spectrum in terms of the disorder. The recommendation here, and these are the recommendations that came from the participants. These are not recommendations that we are making as independent researchers. The recommendations came from the participants, and the first recommendation was the need for updated knowledge and training, which links to the second conclusion. Here, specialists seem to have no specific training. As Michelle mentioned, they seem to learn about autism from literature, from experience, from conferences, etc. Pediatric neurologists are specialists dealing with medical conditions produced by brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and have general education on pediatric neurology. So they are not familiar with diagnostic features of autistic patients. Child psychiatrists also have no special training on diagnosing children with ASD. When asked how they get an understanding on autism, some of them answered, in order to understand that, you need to be a psychiatrist. None of them mentioned objective tools for assessment of children. They have heard about diagnostic criteria for ASD or ICD-10 or DSM-4, but diagnosis was based primarily on observation and conversation with the parents, and conclusions are generally made by specialists like psychologists or defectologists. Interestingly, the psychologists and defectologists have no special training for diagnosis of ASD. Some were trained by invited lectures on selected schools, selected tools like ADOS. The training was devoted mostly to the assessment of cognitive and behavioral abilities of children for implementing some therapeutical approaches like ABA, but not to make a diagnosis. Here, in relation to this conclusion, the recommendation was the need for training. The majority of participants identified this as of primary importance. There is a need for training of all specialists involved in the diagnostic process, which includes neurologists, psychologists, clinical psychologists, or psychiatrists. Training needs to focus on how to use tools and instruments and how to support children. There needs to be a clearer understanding of signs of ASD and clearer instructions on ways to support children with the diagnosis. Medical and psychological pedagogical specialists need training on MCHAT. Often there's a discrepancy between diagnosis of ASD and speech delays. Children with speech delays are referred to correctional centers by PMPCs with the diagnosis of autism, but this may not be the case. The child may not have a speech delay. Social workers need training on how to use ABLLS and how to establish contact with the child. There is also a need to train doctors and pedagogues in ABA to provide rehabilitation for children with autism. The third conclusion was that diagnosis is based primarily on subjective measures, as Michelle has mentioned, such as observation and conversation with parents. Very few are using or administering standardized tests. Responses indicated that diagnosis is predominantly based on subjective measures. It was also evident that the practice of medical doctors referring patients to different specialists and doing many unrelated diagnoses like EEG, MRI, biochemical and genetic analysis. However, a number of NGOs in Kazakhstan, such as Asl Miras and Ashik Alam, are working with children with ASD, and they are using diagnostic tools, which are translated into Russian and Kazakh, like Michelle mentioned, for screening. And they're using assessments such as ADOS and MCHAT. Very few specialists, however, are using specialized standardized tests for screening and diagnosis like MCHAT, ADOS, or CARS. That relate to the indexes of ICD-10 or ICD-11 or DSM-4 or DSM-5 criteria. These were mainly pediatric neurologists and psychologists. One pediatric neurologist explained that she does not use these instruments due to the lack of time. Another suggested that there were problems with the Kazakh translation and interpretation. Here, the recommendation is clearly the need for training on the use of standardized tests and tools like MCHAT and ADOS. The fourth conclusion was that there are insufficient specialists. For example, there are only 3 child psychiatrists in Almaty. And as a result, there is not enough time for diagnosis. Some psychiatrists see up to 17 patients per day. One of the pediatric psychiatrists claimed that there is a need for more defectologists. There is a need for a structure which would include the logopedist, the defectologist, and psychologist. And the consultation with the child psychiatrist should be at the district level. The recommendation here is clearly the need for more specialists to manage workloads. The fourth recommendation is the need for what we found is that psychologists are working privately and using their own tools. This is what participants had said. And so they recommended the need for a more multidisciplinary approach, which would include all of the specialists like psychiatrists, neurologists, psychologists, pedagogical psychologists, defectologists, correctional pedagogues, both for diagnosis as well as treatment, that they needed a more collaborative approach working together. A team approach is advocated to support socialization and to develop additional measures for support. There were other recommendations which included the strengthening of support systems and services, the need for more collaboration with parents, the need for space to conduct examinations, and finally, research was recommended to inform diagnostic and support processes. And that was the study and the data that we uncovered during the study. So we'd like to invite you now to ask any questions. Any questions related to autism and the data around autism, which Michelle has explained. She is actually the expert on autism, and so she will address those questions around any questions around autism and the data related to that. If you have any questions related to the study itself, in terms of the methodology, I will try to address that in collaboration with STAS. So Janar, if we can open this out to any questions.
Вот теперь можно включать микрофон. Пожалуйста, можете микрофон, можете чат, как вам удобно. Коллеги, вопросы задавайте. Любые вопросы.
We did such a good job. It sounds like nobody has a question.
Сложный Мишель Искас, здесь только в чате один вопрос.
Здравствуйте. Здравствуйте.
Вот насколько верно то, что аутизм связан с прививками? Зарина задает вопрос, Абдишева. Она пишет.
In one answer, no, it's not correct. And I will go in and explain why that way of thinking has come about. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was a research study that was published by an academic that linked autism, or the actual onset of autism, to the vaccination, the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. So it's the triple antigen test. And again, it just happens that the MMR is administered around the same time that many children with autism start to present symptoms, like they might be bubbly, kind of little baby, and appear to be developing normally, and then at some point they just stop. So that research study was actually disproven, and the results of that research study were actually fraudulent. So unfortunately, that has created a massive fear in amongst, mothers and parents of the MMR. And I have to say, even myself in 1998, when I had my first child, I was even concerned about that aspect as a new mother. However, as a researcher and a scholar in this area, we know very well that that study was disproven. And again, I will go back to the where I spoke about genetic and environmental factors. So there is almost universal agreement from researchers around the world that a child may have a genetic predisposition. And even way back in the 1940s, Kanner himself indicated that he had noticed very similar personality traits between the boys he was looking at in his research and their parents. So even as far back as the 1940s, a biological or genetic dimension has been indicated. However, recent research acknowledges that, and at the same time also indicates that there may be environmental factors. Now, what those environmental factors are is very difficult to determine. However, we do know that that study that linked the onset or the actual autism itself with the MMR has been disproven.
Thank you, Michelle.
Спасибо.
Any other questions?
Да, есть еще вопрос здесь. Айнур пишет, как заниматься с аутистом, если он привязан к маме и других не воспринимает. И похожий вопрос задает Алла, как определить склонности ребенка для того, чтобы помочь родителям.
Okay, now again, we have a spectrum. And so this is where it makes it very problematic for teachers and for educators to understand the child, particularly if the child has difficulty in communicating or the child prefers not to communicate in a way that typical children like to communicate. However, I mentioned earlier that there are tests for non-verbal intelligence. So the main point when we talk about inclusive education or we talk about supporting the needs of a child, no matter what those needs are, whether those needs are because their parents have divorced and they've got difficulties, behavior problems, whatever they are, is understanding the needs of the child first. So it's not like there's a certain recipe of how to support and deal with every single child with a diagnosis of autism, because they will each be very, very different and they will each require perhaps a slightly different approach. So it's not that you need to be an expert on autism to be able to teach a child with autism. It's understanding some of the main features of the disorder or understanding some of the main difficulties that that child may actually have. So some children also have difficulty, some children with autism also have difficulty, sensory difficulties. They may have a sensory processing disorder, which means that loud noises or bright lights or things like that really disturb them. So it's about, again, also organizing the learning environment to make it very appropriate for the child. And I've seen in Kazakhstan here, NGOs such as DARA, who have supplied a lot of learning equipment and resource rooms that provide the kind of environment for those children to learn. And again, we're talking about a spectrum. So you may have children that are already enrolled in mainstream schools that actually do have a diagnosis of autism, but because they're verbal or they might be highly social or for whatever reason, they're on the higher end of the spectrum. So again, they may have specific needs, but in many cases, in this context, these children may go undiagnosed.
Anar, I just wanted to say, I've noticed a lot of people in the chat are asking for a copy of the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, we can't release the PowerPoint to any of the participants because our report has not been finalized yet. So until that happens, we cannot share the PowerPoint, and we apologize for that.
Еще вот один вопрос есть. Восточно-Казахстанская область, Катын Карагай ауданы, Ластаев мектебі задает такой вопрос. Аутист баланы оқыту үшін жеке жоспар болады ма дейді. Индивидуальный план для обучения ребенка аутиста. Бывает ли индивидуальный?
Бағана мен қазанда істеді, одан кейін.
Okay. Like with any child that has a need, a child that might have a vision impairment, a child that might have a hearing impairment, a child that might have a physical impairment, or some behavioral difficulties. Often, when we talk about an individual education plan, we would be looking at what are the main needs of supporting that child educationally. So for a child with autism, they might have difficulty in staying on task. They might have difficulty in working. They may work better by they may have specific difficulties.
Выключите микрофон. Микрофон выключите. Толком вы тоже выключите микрофон.
Okay, so it's really identifying, when we talk about inclusive education, and both Professor Pather and I are very passionate about inclusive education, it's looking at the needs of the child. So no different to a child with a hearing impairment will have specific needs. A child with ADHD will have specific needs. And so when we have a child that has some very clear specific needs, yes, you may have an individual education plan, but that individual education plan is not for necessarily their whole education. That individual education plan is to specifically support some key areas that that child may need some support in. That means the classroom teacher, when they're planning for teaching the class, may need to provide not just different resources or different ways for the child to engage in the learning material. So yes, the answer is an individual education plan, yes, is very beneficial, certainly for some children with autism, but that is no different to a child with any other need, such as a visual, impairment or a hearing impairment or a behavioral disorder.
Can I also answer this one? As Michelle said, inclusive education is our area of interest and expertise and passion. As Kazakhstan is moving towards a more inclusive system, you are obviously bound to include children with autism into mainstream schools, which means, yes, we understand it's a kind of pressure on teachers, especially those that have no understanding of autism and do not understand the needs of the child. So I think the first step, like Michelle says, is understanding what are the needs of the child and what are the capabilities of children. So instead of looking at what they can't do, look at what these children can do. There are some children on the spectrum who are highly intelligent, who would require programs for gifted and talented. So we cannot always assume that a child with autism would be one that is a slow learner or someone that would require extensive support. And within an inclusive classroom and an inclusive approach to teaching, one is required to differentiate lessons, which means identifying, like Michelle said, the needs and the learning styles of different learners within the class. So you're looking at an IEP and what you include into an IEP for a child with autism, you will have to include those strategies into a general lesson plan. So including the activities that you would require for a child with autism, which would actually benefit other learners as well. So inclusive education and inclusion of all children, including children with autism, requires a particular skill. A skill of differentiating, of knowing children's needs and learning styles, to be able to do that. So it is very possible. It's not impossible to do. So I think, there's various training programs going on. We have also included this into our training program at NUGSC, which look at how to accommodate the diversity of learning styles, including children with particular disabilities in a mainstream classroom. Are there any other questions, Janil? Janil, your sound is off.
Может быть, кто-то задаст сразу вопрос, не только с чата.
Переводите вопрос, пожалуйста. Спрашивает, почему забывает ребенок, то есть долгое время обучается каким-то навыкам, потом во время каникул забывает все навыки. Два вопроса было на этот счет.
Michelle?
Yes. Okay. Sometimes children with a diagnosis of autism have what we call working memory problems. A working memory is said to be the cognitive process that allows you to take in information that you either hear or information that you see and be able to retain it in a memory loop, okay, and then put it into long-term memory. So often when we're teaching children, either with ADHD and also children with autism who may have a working memory challenge, they often need more time to take in that information. And so in teacher training, when we're training pre-service teachers, one of the main things we will tell pre-service teachers is the importance of wait time. When you're asking a question or when you're giving a task for children with autism to do, if there is too many instructions, they will get to the first 2 or 3 and then they will forget the rest. So using visual supports is one of the ways that is a very useful way of being able to provide information. And as my colleague, Professor Pather says, those strategies that we would put in place in a classroom, like having a visual timetable, for example, or a visual instruction list, those strategies benefit all students in the classroom. So you're not necessarily just doing it for one child, you might be doing it, you're doing it for the whole class. So working memory issues, and they can be not just a child with autism, but can be any typical child as well, require a longer wait time or a longer time to process the information.
Thank you, Michelle.
Еще будут вопросы? Мишель, спасибо. Еще будут вопросы? По-моему, еще есть один вопрос. Почему ребенок с синдромом детский аутизм, когда идет на отдых или на каникулы и не ведется работа специалистов, он теряет почти все навыки, которые учились и прививались в течение года?
Okay, I'll go back again. So this is the thing, it may be a working memory difficulty, or there may be another comorbidity that hasn't been identified. Okay, so in the area where we're talking about specific learning disorders or specific learning disabilities, sometimes when a child has with autism has an intellectual impairment, it is because of a different disorder, a comorbidity. When a child has specifically just autism spectrum disorder, it doesn't therefore mean they automatically have an intellectual impairment. So it may be that child has, the child that you're speaking about, forgetting things over summer, it may be that child has autism and another specific learning disability or intellectual impairment. I'm not sure. So without being able to have measurements or objective tools to diagnose the child, the child has just been given a diagnosis of autism. Now, as we know, as a spectrum, that could be anything from this end of the spectrum to this end of the spectrum. And, you know, so it's very difficult to answer that question specifically without knowing the needs of the child. And that's one of the difficulties we have in this context, is that children are just being given a diagnosis of autism, and there is an assumption by some that means intellectual impairment automatically, or they're given a diagnosis of a developmental delay or intellectual impairment. But in actual fact, there's more to the diagnostic process, or there's more to a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder than just putting a specific label on the child. The child that you're speaking about that's forgetting things over summer, that's not going to be the case for every single child with autism. That may indicate there's another comorbidity.
Дамира Каракулова, может, сами зададите вопросы? Дамира, вы здесь, да, в зале?
Да, я здесь. Слышно меня, да?
Да, слышим. Задайте вопрос.
Здравствуйте. Знаете, у меня появилась девочка, вот такая маленькая, 5 лет. Ставили синдром Каннера F85 и F85 и 7. Что-то 2 диагноза. Я там написала, я забыла. Вот F84,5 и F85,0. 2 это диагноза. Девочка очень агрессивная, в одном месте не сидит. Это очень тяжело. С чего я могу начать работу? Вот родители просятся, чтобы там работать с ребенком. Я логопед.
Okay, and this relates again to what my colleague Professor Pather said. This is knowing the needs of the child. If the child, often children, particularly very young children with autism, have difficulties with self-regulation or regulating their behavior. If they have other issues like a sensory processing disorder, there are things in their environment that are bothering them. And because a very young child of 4 or 5 years of age has difficulty articulating or communicating what it is that's actually bothering them. I can't imagine that the child would be aggressive, you know, from morning, the moment they wake up until the moment they go to sleep. But approaching this child or understanding what is causing the behavior, what we often tell specialists to do or parents to do is to start with a journal, okay? And then understanding what are the kinds of things that might be creating this aggressive behavior. So what happened before and what happened after the child displayed this behavior. And over a period of time of mapping behavior across in a journal, we can often see some common themes emerge from that. So it wouldn't necessarily, I mean, the child may associate coming to the speech therapist as a very negative thing and doesn't want to go, or might associate going to the doctor as a very negative experience, doesn't want to go. Any child, you know, might be unhappy about that. It's just the way the child, this child specifically with autism, it's such a negative experience, they don't know, they don't want to do it, they don't know how to handle or self-regulate their emotions or behaviors. So there's understanding first what is causing that behavior. And that would be to start with a journal, the parents with a journal and tracking their days. And often teachers do this as well with, you know, students in school. And I don't mean necessarily children with autism. It could be any child that might display some behavioral difficulties. Time on task as well, specifically for young children. You know, we can't expect young children to be, you know, having to sit and go through things for even 10 minutes. the kinds of strategies that we use with children with autism is starting off by building first we do this and then we do this. First we do this and then we can do this. And that's often is the unpreferred activity first and then the preferred activity later after that. So if we do this for 5 minutes and then you can have this reward. And as the child gets older and we can chain these things together, you can first we do this, then we do this, then we do this, and then you can have your reward. And that's the kind of process that we follow in working with a child. And specifically with a young child at 4 or 5 years of age, that can work really well. It's obviously more difficult working with an 11 and a 12-year-old that has the behavioral problems and they've not been dealt with earlier. And that relates back to the importance of an early diagnosis and early intervention.
Thank you, Michelle.
Спасибо, Мишель.
Okay. Are there no other questions, Janil or Janar?
Вот задает вопрос Фариза Балгабаева. Сами будете, да? Фариза задает вопрос, в чате пишет, как учить ребенка математике и думать логично, для этого какие программы нужны? Было бы лучше, коллеги, если бы сами задали вопрос. Давайте, наверное, тогда определимся, вот с зала, наверное, двое зададут, и на этом, наверное, завершим. Хорошо? 2 вопроса.
Можно еще вопрос задать? Можно, да, вопрос задать еще?
Давайте.
А вот этому ребенку, который синдром Каннера, может, им вообще речи-то нет уже, может, им пока рано работа с логопедом, может, дефектологу, либо психологу я могу отправить их, или как вы думаете? Потому что речь нету, девочка ничего не понимает, это бесполезна эта работа просто как-то. А вознаграждение, ей вообще не нужно никакое вознаграждение, потому что она вообще ничего не понимает.
Okay, again, one of the difficulties with autism is communication. And just because a child doesn't speak doesn't mean they don't understand. In many cases, there's been situations where children with autism haven't spoken for, until they were 7, and then suddenly they speak. That doesn't mean that their intelligence is impaired or that they have an intellectual impairment. And so one of the challenges that I described in the research is that when a child doesn't either want to interact or speak with another person, or is that often intellectual tests, such as the Wechsler, require some verbal, responses and understandings. So if we are only relying on tests that require verbal responses, then if the child's not responding verbally, we cannot assume that that child doesn't understand. Okay, so it's very important to begin working with the child and begin working again, as my colleague said, Professor Pather, is working from what the child can do. Okay, not trying to get the child to do things that maybe are not interested in them. Often we use a child's interest to drive learning. And even with typical children, typical individuals, you know yourself in something, then you will learn that much more easily than
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone. Can I conclude now, Janar? Janar? Okay, so can we finish now? Janar?
Да, конечно, yes, Сурочка.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to receive your questions. And thank you, Professor Michelle Somerton, for answering most of these questions. Thank you, Stas, for also presenting today. We hope that the project has inspired some thoughts around children with autism and how they are being diagnosed in Kazakhstan, and some of the challenges as well as some of the positive things that are happening. As I said in my chat, unfortunately we cannot share the presentation because the data is secure until the report is validated and accepted by the Ministry of Health and Education, and then the report will be published. So we can't share the PowerPoint just yet. We know you are anxious to have it. You will have it towards the end of the year when the report is published. I also want to mention that a lot of you had questions about how to include a child with autism in a mainstream classroom. I just want to say we are having training from the 12th to the 30th of October this year. It's a project training program that is being run by NUGSC, by myself and some of my colleagues, looking at how to include children with disabilities in mainstream classrooms. So that's from the 12th to the 30th of October. We talk about the strategies that I talked earlier around differentiation, around learning, like Michelle was saying, how do you learn about the needs of children and their learning styles, etc., etc. So if you'd like to attend, if you can send your email addresses to Janil or Janar, and they will compile the list, and my colleague Asya will then email you the details about how to get onto the Zoom link for that training. So again, it's from the 12th to the 30th of October. So once again, thank you very much for attending. I noticed that there were over 250 participants today, which is really very good. So we are grateful for you for setting aside the time to join us and for listening so intently and for your questions. Thank you. Michelle, would you like to say anything, or Stas?
No, I would just like to acknowledge, the work of my colleagues, Professor Pather and also Stas for and also Professor Altenshas Dakstabayeva and Valentina Stolyaronova, I can't even say it, Stolyaronova from the School of Medicine in the time and effort. I'd like to acknowledge support from the Ministry of Education and acknowledge support from the Ministry of Health in being so positive towards encouraging this research. So thank you very much, colleagues.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Yes, I forgot to mention that my thanks to the project team. As Michelle said, they have been incredible. We've managed to finish this project before COVID happened and the lockdown. Hence, we have all this data to share with you today. So thank you very much to Michelle and Stas and Altenshas and Valentina for their support as well. And like Michelle said, for the support from the Ministry of Education. We met with Aigiram when we first looked at doing the project, and she afforded us a really incredible support and a positive spirit, that was coming from the Ministry of Education in looking at how important this project was going to be. So hopefully, we are hoping that the recommendations that we put forward in the report will be taken further in trying to strengthen the diagnostic process for children, not just with autism, but also for children with intellectual impairment, because that was another issue that we were looking at. So thank you again, everyone. And thank you to the Ministry of Education. Thank you, Janil, for the invitation to participate in the conference today. And yeah, have a lovely week and hopefully we will meet again.
Thanks a lot, Shni.
Уважаемые участники, нам еще раз приятно сказать большое спасибо Солошни, Мишель и Стас и всем участникам. Большое спасибо. С началом нового учебного года. Пусть август принесет только удачи нашим семьям. Будьте здоровы, берегите себя и, естественно, близких. Спасибо большое. Спасибо, Жанар, за перевод. Үлкен рахмет. Сау болыңыздар, тағы да жаңа оқу жылы құтты болсын.
Bye-bye.